Hey everybody, welcome to Dakari's fifth live uh, fire investigative training session. Tonight we're going to uh, have Ralph Sheffer. He is a forest ranger with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and he's going to talk to us tonight about wildland fire investigations. Ralph has been with the Wisconsin DNR for 23 years. He is a certified wildland fire investigator and has been since 2003. He's an instructor with the NWCG course, which is course FI 210, the Wildland Fire and Origin Cause Determination, and has had that certification since 2007. He's investigated over 400 fires, including 2 fatalities, several of which have all been incendiary or arson fires. So without any further ado, Ralph, go ahead and take it away, sir.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for having me here. Like Bill said, we're going to talk about wildland fire cause origin determination. I understand there is a little bit of delay when I click through a screen, so I'll try and keep that in mind. Many of you are familiar with, here in the US, familiar with NFPA, the National Fire Protection Agency. NFPA 921 handles the investigation aspect of it. But wildland cause and origin determination is governed by the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, or NWCG. NFPA 921 mirrors NWCG as far as terminology and methodology, and it pretty much refers back to NWCG. Case law has established that the NWCG, the course FI 210, and its terminology, methodology supersedes anything that NFPA 921 has, but they are trying to get them very similar, actually exactly the same, so that there's less confusion out there. But as we sit here, and look at, there's a number of fire investigators out there on this training here, fire department members that may not be official investigators, but may have to track down determine how the fire started. We all recognize that determining the origin, the ignition factors, responsible parties, that's our purpose. That's what we're there for. Trying to figure out how the fire started and who started it. Where did it start? In a wildland fire situation, we're looking at how do we go from this large fire, maybe, it may be a 5-acre fire, it may be a 5,000-acre fire, 50,000-acre fire. How do we go from that down to finding what started the fire, and in this case, finding the match that started that fire? And it can be tricky. It can be, sometimes you just can't find exactly what started it. But as long as you follow the methodology, you use that systematic methodology, work through it the same way every single time, you can read the physical indicators that the fire leaves on the objects, be able to determine where that fire started. You can trace back that fire's progression back to its origin. And you can trace it back to the first materials that were ignited and the potential ignition source. Like I said, sometimes you can't find an ignition source, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So those indicators, they're that roadmap, trying to figure out how you get back to where this fire started. The more training you take, the more times you practice it, the more times you put it into use, leads to more proficiency. This is something that, especially early on, if you don't use it a whole lot, you do lose it. But the more often you do it, the easier this comes. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that with fires, we, in the grand scheme of things, we would prefer fires not to start, but you kind of need those fires in order to become proficient at this. Excuse me. So as some of the terminology we use in the wildland fire is fire progression. It's that outward progress of the first material ignited. You retrace that progression back to the origin. So where did that fire go? How did that fire burn? Taking it back to the origin area. How we do that is we look at the indicators, fire direction indicators. They're those physical objects that display changes, those fire effects caused by exposure to heat, flame. It's an accurate analysis. An accurate analysis can reveal that fire progression at that precise point. The thing is with those fire indicators, by taking them singly, they tell you what that fire is doing at that exact point, which may not be what the overall fire progression does, but it is a single component to that overall fire pattern. So you look at those individual indicators, you see what the majority of those indicators are telling you, and that gives you the overall fire pattern. This in turn lets you know how that fire burned, where it went, how did it go? Did it do a shift with wind here? Did it react to topography there? Did suppression action have an influence on it in this location? By looking at those individual indicators to get to that fire pattern and the fire progression. Some other terminology as we're talking about with the wildfire is we talk about the ignition area. This is the point, this is the area that first materials are ignited and the fire starts. We call it an ignition area. We do not call it a point of ignition in a wildland fire for reasons that, you know, looking at if this goes to court, say it's an arson fire or a significant fire that goes to court, and you call it a point of ignition, an attorney can go, are you exactly positive that that match lit that blade of grass on fire? So we use the term ignition area. We know that in this location, the fire started. Other terminology we use in wildland fire investigation is advancing fire. It's a cleaner burn, causes more damage, gives you the macro scale indicators, things that you can easily see. This is where the head of the fire is. This is where it's burning with the wind upslope. Lateral fire has some residual fuels, somewhat clean burn, and it's 45 to 90 degrees from what that advancing fire was. And then lastly, you have backing fire, where you have many more residual fuels. It's lower intensity fire, not as clean of a burn in order for that as that fire progressed. So it leaves a lot more clues for you in the backing fire. Transition zones, those are the areas where it's changing from, it's that borderline between, say, advancing fire and lateral fire, or lateral fire and backing fire. So you see some indicators of both on those. It may be somewhat clean burn. It may be have a lot of bit of residual indicators there, but that's your transition zone. As we talk about advancing fire, we're looking at that rapid fire spread, the head fire. It's that forward run, burning with the wind, upslope, highest intensity fire, most difficult part to control. Gives you those macro scale indicators, those indicators that you can easily see. Backing fire, lower intensity, much slower rate of spread. It's going against the wind. It's going down slope. Leaves a lot more residual fuels there and gives you the micro scale indicators. These are some things that, you know, you may have to get down on your hands and knees in order to see them, see what they look like, in order to find them, to be able to trace back where that fire came from. But this is the backing fire is the slower rate of spread, easiest to control, lowest intensity. Lateral fire is the in-between, the advancing and the backing. It's perpendicular to the wind, perpendicular to the slope. Rate of spread and intensity is in between advancing and backing. Spreads lateral to the main fire. And then you look at, like I mentioned, those transition zones. It's that directional area of directional or intensity change. You see a difference in indicators. You need to look for those transition zones as you're doing your investigation to be able to determine where the advancing was, where the lateral was, where the backing fire was. And it is the key to accurately interpreting those burn patterns. You really want to find those transition zones in order to see what's happening. So as an example, you have, lateral fire burning from right to left here, advancing fire burning from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. You have some pretty clean burn there on the right-hand side. You have a few residuals, residual grass stems on the left-hand side, kind of in the middle. That's your transition zone. Where is that borderline between the advancing and the lateral fire? Again, that allows you to be able to accurately track how that fire burned. As we look at some of those indicators that are out there, and we'll get into the individual indicators, we look at pattern clusters. You get multiple indicators out there, gives you that consistent directional spread. The more you have, the more variety you have, the different types of indicators you have, gives you greater reliability. So you look at, in this example that we have up here, the bottle, you can see kind of on the right-hand side of the bottle, there's some taller stems. They're burnt, but there's some unburned there. Left-hand side of the bottle, pretty clean burn right up to it. And grass stems are pretty well gone. There's some white ash deposit on the bottom of the bottle. So they're looking at a few things. If you removed that bottle, you can easily see you have a clean burn line on the left-hand side. You have residual protected grass stems on the right-hand side, showing that fire burned from left to right in that situation. Now looking at the overall patterns, the overall indicators that are out there, besides just this bottle, help you determine, is it advancing fire, lateral fire, or backing fire? So you have to look at everything. You can't just look at those one little spot. So some of the principles of burn pattern interpretation is take a look at the majority of the indicators. Try and look at multiple things. Single indicators may be unreliable. Again, they reflect the fire direction, that fire behavior at that precise point. But because fire changes, fire burns in different directions, reacting to wind, slope, reacting to the fuels, it may not be completely accurate for the overall pattern. And that single indicator may be accurate within a 180-degree arc. So you can't really don't ever go off of that one single indicator. Put them all together. And if you're out there and you see one that is, everything is pointing one direction, and you see one that's really off the wall, and you don't feel that it had moved, wind blew something in, or suppression action did, or it was altered, basically you throw out that indicator. You recognize that it's there, but as for the overall fire pattern, overall fire progression, you throw out that one outlier. It just doesn't make any sense for you. So we look at, some of these indicators as you see on the screen here, and this was backing fire from left to right. You have grass stem indicators with the seed head pointing towards where the fire came from. You look at the leaf down in the lower right-hand corner, you see some charring on the edges of it, but the remainder of it off towards the right there and to the bottom of the screen is protected. It was not burned up. You have additional grass stem indicators, recognizing that they are within 180 degrees. You can determine that the overall fire progression was from left to right, with the amount of indicators that are still present, fuel that is still present, the grass stems, the leaves not burned, it's not really clean burn. Then you can pretty much surmise that it's either backing or lateral fire. In this case, it's backing fire. One thing with grass stems, well, we'll get into grass stem indicators. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But they usually become less pronounced as you get near the origin. The thing with wildland fire versus structural fire is, a structural fire investigation. You're going from the least burned area to the most intense burned area. As far as wildland fire, it's just the opposite. Fire starts small, takes them a little bit to basically get that life, get their personality, I like to call it, start getting reaction to the wind, to the fuels, to the slope. And then the intensity increases as you go, as that fire progresses. So as you get near the origin, some of those indicators are less pronounced. You get those micro scale indicators where you really have to get down and look at things. And like I said, you may have to actually get down on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass in order to see them. So wildland fire, we work from most intense burned area to the least intense burned area, zigzagging back and forth across the laterals. That initial transition zone may be hard to define where it started. So you go to the area that's most intense, you get more definitive indicators, and it prevents destroying that ignition area. If you start from, the origin of the fire right away and start walking through it, you can destroy some of those micro scale indicators. You may actually destroy the ignition source as well. So look at those macro scale indicators, work your way back down to the origin area, the specific origin area, and finally the ignition area. The other thing, working from the most intense to the least intense, and doing that is there are times that you have multiple ignition areas, you have multiple starts. In this fire that's on the picture right here, this was a fire that actually was about 160 acres, I believe it was, in Richland or Crawford County, excuse me. And you have to also talk to the suppression resources that are out there, because this got much bigger because they could not, because of topography, they could not go directly on the fire. So there was a lot of burnout activity. They went farther out and burned out their control lines. But from talking to the incident commander, I was able to determine that I did not need to, as you see, there's quite a bit off to the left there. I did not need to walk through a lot of that, because that was from suppression action and burnout operations. So again, work from the most intense, crossing back and forth to the least intense. If you have multiple investigators, you can basically go in a line and work your way through. As you get down towards that, where you believe that ignition area is, things start getting a little more confusing, a little bit harder to tell. Work your way back out, making sure you have backing indicators towards the rear of the fire, and then you can enter the ignition area, again, coming from the most burned to the least burned, from the advancing fire, working your way back towards the backing fire part to check that ignition area and find that ignition source. I think we should all be aware, try and avoid attempts to prematurely locate the origin. Some of those indicators may be subtle in that origin area. When you get down to what you believe is the specific origin area, you're looking at, try not to get it any smaller to start with than a 5 foot by 5 foot area. You want to keep it, be sure, even though if you're fairly certain, you just want to be able to make sure. And again, it's that systematic method. Avoid that pressure to rush. For some of us, in my position now as an investigator, it's a little easier. When I was initial attack and doing investigations, there were times that, I'd have 4 or 5 fires in a day. It was nothing for that to happen. So any investigation was rather quick because I had another fire popping and getting paged to another fire. So kind of had to rush it, but now as an investigator, assigned investigator, really, really take your time on it if you have to. Don't rush it. Don't make those leaps. I've done it before and it can come back and bite you. Luckily, when I did it, it was not a serious incident. So again, working from advancing, crossways to lateral, working your way back to the least burned area. Looking at those indicators. There are a number of indicators. There's 11 indicator classes that are out there. We're looking at, they are defined in NFPA as well as NWCG. Protection indicators, and I'll get into each of these. Protection, grass stem, foliage freeze, angle of char, spalling, curling, sooting, staining, ash deposits, cupping, and then the V pattern. V pattern, I don't get much into this and this, but the V pattern is just the overall fire shape. Fires, when they're wind driven, slope driven, they burn. The narrowest part is towards the origin, widest part is up towards the head. So they burn in a V pattern or a U pattern. And you can utilize that, you know, if you have photos from aircraft or whatnot to be able to help track you back. But protection indicators, pretty much exactly what it says. Fuels are less damage appearance on the non-origin side. So you're looking at, as an example, these grass stems. To the left-hand side, you have more damage. You can see the fire burned right up to it. Off to the right, there were less damage. You have some leaves mixed into it, dead leaves mixed into it. They were protected. The clump of grass itself protected it from the fire. You'll see this also, you know, behind tree stems, rocks, things like that. You'll see unburned fuel on the back side of it. The other thing is you'll see is on water bodies. If a fire is big enough, burns around water bodies, there'll be that area, you know, we call it the fire shadow on the downwind side of that fire. You know, the fire burns out around, comes back together on the other side, leaving some unburned fuel on the downwind side of that water body. You know, looking at, you know, example here, there was a rock, the rock that you see sitting there, they flipped it over. You can see clean burn kind of to the bottom and lower right-hand side of the screen. If you look at the upper left-hand side of the screen, you see grass stems still standing, little blades of grass still standing there. Those were protected. The rock sheltered them, protected them. So the fire burned from basically bottom to top or lower right to upper left on your fire direction, because you're looking at those protected fuels on the other side to tell you which way the fire came from. One thing you want to be cautious of is a false indicator out there. If you have, as in this example, you have a down tree that's suspended in the air, it will actually have more damage on the downwind side of the fire. So in this case, the fire came from left to right. Reason that occurs is with the limb being suspended, the trunk being suspended, the fire went underneath it and then curled back around on the leeward side of it. So that's where it's getting that more damage. So if it's suspended, the least damaged side is actually the side that the fire came from. So you got to watch those false indicators that are out there and be cautious of those. That's protection. Getting into grass stem. This is a good indicator, especially for backing fire in grass fuel type that, you know, has not been compacted due to snowpack or what have you. You have residual stems left after the fire passes. They will fall and the seed head will point in the direction that the fire came from. So as you can see, some of those grass stems that are out there, the basic fire progression was from right to left. So as we look at those grass stems and how they're formed, you know, your advancing fire, that most intense fire will actually burn that grass stem, the stalk from the top down, consuming all but the base of it. Lateral fire may leave some because again, it's a little lower intensity, but that backing fire will burn the stalks off at the base. And then it's just like cutting a tree down. It cuts the base off and the grass stem falls into the burned area with that seed head pointing in the direction that the fire came from. One thing that you need to be cautious with these is if the grass is tall enough, that actual seed head may fall over the top of the ignition area and your ignition source. So it may actually fall on top of it and cover it for you. So just have to watch that and be cautious of that if you're out there and you're utilizing this grass stem indicators. Your advancing fire is a much cleaner burn. All the grass stem, again, because it's burning from the top down, all that's left is the base of that grass stem, much cleaner burn. Where you have that residual, where those grass stems fall in, gives you much more of a backing fire indicator. So in this case, the fire is burning from bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. Those transition zones near the origin may form recognizable patterns. You can get from backing to advancing, lateral areas may be outlined. And you have three common patterns in the grass stem. The circular, where the fire backs away from the origin in all directions. This occurs when you have no slope, no wind to influence that ignition area or the specific origin area. And all the grass stems fall inwards towards the origin. And they're all just pointing right into the middle of it, pointing here, essentially it's like a neon sign. When you have this, it's a neon sign pointing, here it is, here's where your ignition area is. You may get that U or V pattern where the fire is beginning to be influenced by the wind or slope shortly after ignition. Good definitive transition zone between the backing and advancing areas. And you also have lateral areas visible. The grass stems, again, fall in towards the origin along the backing and lateral transition zones, forming that V or U pattern. The clean burn area then is your advancing fire. Excuse me. So those are the three types that you get from your grass stem patterns near the origin: the V or U-shaped or circular shape. Angle of char. There's also angle of scorch, although the official indicator is angle of char. They're formed by the same process. The difference between the two is a matter of heat, duration, fire intensity. You're looking at conifer type trees. Scorch is where the needles have been cooked, but they don't fall off. They're not burned up. Where angle of char, they're completely burned off. So you can look at, in this slide here, looking at it, the angle of char, angle of scorch, you can see how it forms a definitive angle on the trees, showing that in this case, the fire came from left to right, was a pretty intense fire as it took out, all the needles on that one tree. But you can see on the left-hand side of that tree, there's still some needles there, although they're scorched and dead. But it forms that definitive angle. This is a macro scale indicator, again, showing advancing fire coming from left to right. You get this because of the effects of the wind, draws the flame up that leeward side. If you does it on tree trunks, does it on power poles, pretty much anything that's out there, angle of char. Under high winds, that lee side can extend to great heights. As you see in this picture, it's going pretty much all the way to the top of that power pole there. But if you look at the base of it, and here's a closer shot of it, you see a definite angle at the base of the fire, or base of the pole, excuse me, showing the fire. It's going to be higher. In an advancing fire, it's going to be higher on the downwind side, lower on the side that the fire came from. So in this case, the fire went from left to right. You can see, caused by the wind, you get that vortex on the other side of the wind, makes that charring, can make that charring go all the way up to the top of the pole. Backing indicators with angle of char, it will be either level or parallel with the slope, or it may form, if it does go higher up, it may form an L shape, or what we call, or a barber chair is what we call it. But looking at the base of the tree, as you get in closer, you can see that it is pretty level before it climbs up the tree. So in a backing fire, and in a backing fire with angle of char indicator, it's going to be higher on the, again, on the downwind side of the fire, but the higher side is going to be pointing towards where the fire was coming from. And looking at it at the base, majority of it is pretty parallel to the slope, to the topography, before it makes that strong climb up on the left-hand side of that tree. So here the fire came from right to left, backing fire, angle of char. Sooting, this is where you get incomplete combustion. That soot can adhere to rocks, cans, barbed wire, just about anything that's out there. It's easily rubbed off. And it's formed on the side exposed to the flame. So looking at these rocks, you can see sooting occurring on the left-hand side of the rocks. The right-hand side is fairly well protected, showing that fire came from left to right, because it's a fairly clean burn. Otherwise, it's considered advancing fire in this part. You're seeing a lot of needles down on the ground, dead brown needles. But in this case, more than likely what happened is you have needle cast after the fire passed. And that will happen, and it can get a little bit confusing if you're not familiar with it. Where the fire goes through, it's hot enough intensity to kill the needles on the tree. This also happens with leaves, oak leaves especially. It can kill the leaves on the tree, kill the needles on the tree, and then after a day or two, they will fall off. So if you're not able to get out there to investigate the fire right away, if you're out there a day or two later, you may see a bunch of this unburned needles over the top of the burned area, but recognize that that's needle cast, and that occurred after the fire happened. As you're dealing with, say, barbed wire fences, you can take your fingers, rub both sides of them, put the fence in between you, rub both sides, and the sooting will stick to your finger, in this case on the thumb, showing that the fire came from the bottom of the screen towards the top of the screen. Again, the sooting is on the side where the fire came from, because the wind is depositing that ash, or that soot, excuse me, on that object. White ash happens similar to sooting on it, except it's a little bit more complete combustion. You get the ash blowing in the wind, sticking to an object, sticking to standing vegetation, sticking to down logs. So that exposed side is going to look whiter than the other side. Protected side is going to be a little bit darker, more color to it. So as you're looking here, comparing both sides of this log, the exposed side has quite a bit of that ash attached to it, adhered to it. Backside, not so much. It's a bit darker. You have some protection. You have some unburned portions of that log, showing that the fire came on the right-hand picture. The exposed side, fire came from bottom going to the top of the screen. In grass stands, if you don't have any standing vegetation, brush, trees, fence posts, anything like that, if it's a pure grass field, when you're standing near the origin and you're looking down fire, down towards the advancing fire, you will see the white ash. It'll look, you'll see it laying out there. If you're standing from the advancing part looking back towards the origin, you're not going to see the white ash. It's going to be a bit darker. So here in this slide, looking at, standing in the middle of the fire, left-hand picture, these were taken from the same spot. Left-hand picture, you can see the white ash in the grass, in the burned area where the grass was. That's advancing fire from going from bottom of the screen to the top. On the right-hand side it looks a lot darker. You're not seeing that white ash. You're looking back towards the origin. Fire came from top to bottom on that right-hand side, the advancing fire. Okay. One of the downsides of this, you know, is white ash after a while, it'll go away. If you have rain, even high humidity days, it'll go away. You're not going to see it as well. So it can be, you know, you have to get out there pretty much right away in order to find it, unless you have really dry conditions for a number of days. Smaller micro scale indicators, you will see that white ash on the smaller brush, but you may have to get closer to the ground in order to see it. Backing fire, you're not going to get as much white ash than you will in the advancing fire, but it will be there. Again, the reliability decreases with time, can be inconsistent under strong variable wind conditions. But if it's there, it can be a good indicator for you. Can be fairly easy to see. Next, we'll look at cupping. This is where as the fire progresses, it burns off a stem. You'll see a concave or cupped shape charring on it. The ends will have the cup with the lower portion pointing towards the origin, the taller portion pointing towards the advancing area of the fire. If it's laying on the ground, the blunted rounded off portion will be pointing towards where the fire came from. Non-exposed side will be that higher portion. So looking at the picture there, you can see how there's an angle to the cup from lower end to the left, higher end to the right. Fire came from left to right. You can see it on standing vegetation as well. You know, can be tough to see a little bit, especially on smaller stuff. But if you could look closely at this one, if you were, you would see that the stems on the right-hand side, you know, they're fairly well burned off. You have longer stems on the left-hand side. Fire came from right to left. Again, the exposed side has the majority of the damage. Usually see it on fuels 1/2 inch in diameter or smaller. You won't see it too much on bigger stuff. You can see it on cattails, which are a little bit bigger. They do show it, but when you start getting into larger trees and things like that, you know, bigger than 1/2 inch, an inch, it's hard to tell whether that was caused by the fire or some other means. So it's a little bit less reliable on the bigger stuff. Also less reliable on decaying wood and stuff that's you know, punky and soft. That screws fire up as well. Foliage freeze. This occurs, it's a really good macro indicator on an advancing fire on trees like these small oak trees or on conifer trees. And it's what happens is as the fire burns through, the heat softens the leaf up, and then the wind is pushing it in the direction the fire is going as well. After the fire passes, it cools off and hardens up and points in the direction that the fire was going, the direction the wind is going, which is the direction the fire was going as well. You know, and looking at this picture again, looking at multiple indicators that are out there, you can see on the trees in the background, you can see angle of char, higher char on the left-hand side of the trees, lower char on the right-hand side of the trees, especially in the background, showing advancing fire from right to left. Curling, the microscale indicator, reacts pretty much the same as foliage freeze, but it's a good indicator of backing fire, low intensity fire. You'll see it on smaller herbaceous vegetation. And again, is what happens is as the fire is progressing through, heats the vegetation up, heats the leaves up, they curl towards that heat source, and after the fire passes, they're stuck in that position. They're hardened back up again. That shrinkage causes the edges to curl, like I said, towards the heat source. It's a micro scale indicator of backing fire, with it pointing, curling back towards the direction the fire came from. Similar to foliage freeze. In this case, the fire came from left to right. Spalling occurs on rocks. You need some pretty significant heat for this to happen. You'll see on the rocks light colored craters or chips that have flaked off. You know, looking at this rock, you see some heavy sooting on it, and then you see that white patch in the middle right there. So what happens is the heat causes that rock to expand, causes any moisture in it to essentially evaporate, turn to gas, from liquid to gas, and it just forces that piece to pop off due to that rapid expansion. Usually it's smaller pieces flake off unless you have really, really high intensity fire. You need a good significant fire in order for this occur. Here in Wisconsin, where I've witnessed it more often is larger rocks around a home that had burned during a wildfire, and all of the spalling occurred pointing to where that structure had been burning because it had that high heat source there. But again, with this, you'll get sooting on there as well to help you out. So in this case, you have spalling, sooting, and it's pointing at the direction the fires came from. So on this big rock, you're looking at the fire coming from basically bottom of the screen towards the top, or going farther into the screen. So those are the main indicators. And the other one that I didn't have a slide up there for, again, is that V or U-shaped pattern. It's just the way the fire burns, and you can get an idea of that from aerial photography. If you have a plane flying overhead, taking photos for you, help you kind of track things back. As we go through and start looking at indicators and doing our investigation, we can place flags to mark what we're seeing out there. When we do that, the recommended method is red flags for advancing fire, yellow flags for lateral fire, blue flags is backing fire, white flags are for evidence, if you see evidence out there, and green flags, lime green flags, are just points of interest, something you may want to come back and look at a little later date. And it's something that, you know, just because you put, say, a yellow flag down at one point doesn't mean you can't change it after looking at more stuff to change it to a red flag or change it to a blue flag, because you figure, well, instead of lateral, it's more advancing, it's more backing fire there. But is what those flags do, if you do place those out there, and if it's a suspected arson, I would highly recommend arson fire. I would highly recommend that you do it. And you take pictures of it, you can sit back and it really points to, you know, here's where that fire started. If you're placing flags, you know, there's a couple ways I've seen doing it. I've seen people, there's no real set method, but I would just recommend that you be consistent with it. I have seen people who place the flag at an angle pointing the direction the fire is going. And I've seen people place flags in the direction that the fire came from. And then as you get back and look at it after you place your flags, you know, if you pointed the flags the direction the fire is going, everything comes back to a V, right where the ignition area is. If you haven't pointed in the direction the fire is coming to, it all kind of comes back and points, you know, here's the spot type deal. Or you can just stick them straight up and down. There's really no specified method for that, but I've just seen a couple things there. So whichever works, whichever you're comfortable with. But again, red is advancing, yellow is lateral, blue is backing, white is evidence, green is points of interest. If you do not have those colors, be consistent with your flags, your color flags. Have multiple colored flags. Be consistent with which ones are advancing, which ones are lateral, which ones are backing, and make note of that in your report, your investigative report, of what those colors mean for you. So as you start working the general origin area, the general origin area can be a fairly significant size one. As we look at, say, a fire burn 50 acres or 50,000 acres, we don't have to walk that entire area, that entire 50 or 50,000 acres. Your general origin area can be maybe quarter acre, half acre in size, whatever you feel kind of gives you that good location of where you believe the fire started. But again, enter from the advancing area, work your way back towards that ignition area. Working from the advancing, crossing back and forth to the laterals to your ignition area. And again, if you have multiple people, multiple investigators, you can kind of create a line and have that discussion. Well, I have lateral fire over here. Well, this indicator is showing advancing here, and you can start working, etc., and start working your way back. Be slow, be methodical, and get you down to your specific origin area. Again, this is that 5x5, 10x10 type area. This is the area where things really, you got to slow down. Things start getting subtle, extremely subtle, and you may have to get down on your hands and knees to take a look to see what all of it's telling you to do. And you can do a grid search, or you can lay out strings, do a lane search, just to slow yourself down and work your way through that specific origin area down to the ignition area. And once you've determined what your ignition area, where your ignition area is, and if you have found an ignition source, work your way past it, photograph it, mark it, photograph it, everything. If it's evidence that you feel you need to collect right away so it doesn't get damaged, go ahead and grab it, use the proper method for collecting evidence, and then work past it to make sure that everything, your backing indicators and everything else, all your indicators are pointing to that. So you're not, you may see a match out there and go, oh, here it is, but that match was not actually, the person may have lit the grass with the match and then tossed the match, so it's not where the ignition area actually is. So you want to make sure that all your indicators, as you're going through it, point back to that ignition area. So it's kind of the methodology and the things that you're looking for out there. Just kind of quick and easy, subtle, or not subtle, but quick and easy aspect of it. Then we get to the ignition factors. What is it that are out there? And the challenge to find out what started the fire, you found out where it is, now what started it, is sometimes you're looking for something that is usually quite small, probably quite black, in the middle of a whole lot of black stuff. And it can be extremely difficult. But the ignition categories that are out there, some of them are pretty easy to see, to locate, some of them not so much. Lightning can leave a visible mark on the trees. You'll see that scarring on there from the lightning strike. That tree may be laying down, just so you know. It may have fallen over after being struck by lightning. It may have blown apart. The tip is blown off, the top of the tree is blown off, and the remains consumed in the fire. But lightning strike fires leave a pretty good evidence to it. You may find blowholes at the base of trees. And with lightning strike fires, obviously you have to verify that lightning was in the area at the time of the fire. The one place where it can get a little tricky for you is if it strikes a fence, it can send that current down the fence for some distance. We've had fires that, the lightning struck and hit the right-of-way fence along the interstate, and the fire actually started about a quarter to a half a mile away. So keep that in mind as well. You can track. Bureau of Land Management maintains a system of lightning strikes, and it is pretty accurate, about 500 meters with 80 to 90% detection rate. So it will help you know that yes, lightning did occur in that area. And we'll also tell you, is it a positive or negative charge? Positive charge lightning strikes start more fires because it's a longer duration strike. Thing is, even if you find something else, you have to make sure you rule out lightning. Just again, as you're going through this investigation, what is a defense attorney going to poke a hole into when you're on the stand? So you have to rule it out, which can be fairly easy. And there have been no thunderstorms with lightning in the last 3 weeks in this area. Western scenario, drier, arid regions out west, dry lightning is a significant cause of fires. Here in the lake states, when we get lightning, typically we're blessed with a lot of water, so we don't get a whole lot of lightning strike fires. Campfires. Campfire defined as for cooking or warming a person or religious or ceremonial purposes. Take a look at what was there, talk to witnesses, talk to somebody who, potentially was there. Is it in an actual campsite, a remote campsite? We've had fires start from remote canoe campsites that people just didn't properly extinguish and they're gone. Or they left it unattended, didn't clear enough around it, etc. Improper use of accelerants. Did they pour gas on it to try and get it to go? Things like that. But it's fairly obvious. But again, track your indicators back to that campfire just to make sure that that is the reason. I have had fires start that actually there was a campfire ring there, but everything in that campfire ring was cold. It was actually started by a piece of equipment and burned through the campfire ring. So, again, you have to be thorough about things. Smoking. Smoking in a wildland situation, there are these fire safe cigarettes out there, but they're primarily designed for interior upholstery. Informal research shows they may continue to burn in a wildland environment. They have long been the scapegoat in cases where no other cause of a fire could be determined. For here in the lake states, again, it is a pretty remote chance that a cigarette actually started a wildland fire. The reason being is for that cigarette to start a wildland fire, you need that fine fuel bed, need loose fuel arrangement, so it's not compacted by winter snowpack. You need 80 degrees, 80 degrees or higher temperature, relative humidity at 22% or less, and winds typically 20 miles an hour or greater. Add to that, you need about 30% or more of that glowing tip come in contact with the fuel bed with the tip oriented into the wind, and it is actually burrowed into the fuel bed a bit to shelter it. So in a wildland situation here in the lake states, when I hear it was smoking, I get really, really suspicious that was the actual case. Again, you get some of the dry, arid areas out west, southwest. It is a more viable option. But for here in the lake states, northeast U.S., I'd be suspicious of it. However, when you look at it, you have that very narrow window of ignition factors to try and get it going. My former supervisor actually sat there with a bit of grass and a cigarette and tried to get it going while he was actively puffing on the cigarette, and he could not get the grass to light. So, however, the matches that they use to light their cigarette, light their cigar or pipe, they toss that without really putting it out. That is considered a smoking caused fire. That is a much more viable option as far as a cause for us for smoking here in the lake states. So it is there, but that you'll find out through investigation and interviewing witnesses and potentially the responsible party. I have had them say that, you know, oh yeah, I threw my match down. I was smoking a cigar, threw my match down, and that must have in that area, and that started the fire. Didn't necessarily believe them because there happened to be a burn pile right there too, brush pile. And they said they threw the match right near that, but I couldn't get them to crack, and it was difficult to try and get something else out of them. So debris burning, this is our #1 cause in the state of Wisconsin. Cause for fire, people burning their leaves, you know, from their yard cleanup, burning trash, things like that. Your factors are similar to escape campfires, you know, wind-blown embers or creeping into the uncleared vegetation. Cause is usually obvious, but again, don't just jump to the conclusion that, hey, there's a brush pile there burning. That was obviously the cause. I did that one time, and the farmer who I was familiar with, he was a repeat customer, let's say, he called me on it and said that he was not burning, and he was adamant he was not burning that brush pile, because if he was, those buckets of used waste oil that were sitting there would have been thrown on the fire as well. That I believed him, and I went back and looked, and sure enough, the fire backed into the brush pile, burned past it, and then burned back into it. And the cause was actually his tractor that, when he fired it up, spat fire out the exhaust like crazy. So again, don't rush into it. Equipment caused fires. There's a number of different things with equipment caused fires that fall into this category. Railroad is not equipment caused. Railroad is its own cause, just so you know. But there's 5 main ignitions through equipment caused: exhaust system particles, friction, fuel or lubricant spills, fluids, mechanical breakdown or malfunctions, and then radiant or conductive heat transfer. Looking at the exhaust, it can originate, again, from any internal combustion engine. Carbon particles spit out of the exhaust system is a common ignition source. Diesel engines are much more prone to ejecting larger carbon particles, which are much more easier to cause fires, although they're getting better and better as technology upgrades. But they can be anywhere from 1600 to 3000 degrees when they're spit out of there. Maximum distance they found through testing has been about 45 feet, although many of them are much closer. And the kicker of it is the minimum particle size that they found is 0.023 inches. That carbon particle has to be. So basically it's a size of a pin. Can still cause a fire. Although particles up to 1/2 inch and larger are not uncommon, especially in some of those diesel exhaust things. So as you're looking at it, you know, you have a fire. One, is it around a roadway? Is it around a place where there was equipment that was operating? Downgrades or upgrades on highways, you know, is it carrying a heavy load? Is it shifting to use the engine as a to slow it down going downhill, or are they really stepping on the gas to try and get up the hill? More often will cause carbon particles to be ejected out of the exhaust system. You get cut banks, allow it to shoot right into that, causing that fire. Catalytic converters, when they fail, they can cause fires. You know, they may be ceramic bead type, or they may be have a honeycomb monolith in them. And you know, you can find these along the roadway in the ignition area along highways. It is a very, you know, honeycomb. Looking at the lower right hand picture, excuse me, you know, you get that honeycomb out there. It's very light in weight. It's almost weightless, to be honest with you. You'll see those particles in those chunks in the ignition area. That converter, when it malfunctions, it overheats, gets to about 2400, 2800 degrees, and it ejects that stuff out the exhaust system. It basically breaks it apart, ejects it out the exhaust system. 2800 degrees obviously will start a fire. Minimum temperature for wildland ignition is 451 degrees Fahrenheit. On average with the fuels, it's about 600 degrees. So 2400 degrees will certainly light it. Typically, these are close to the roadway. These ignitions are close to the roadway. The tailpipe close to the ground limits how far it's going to be ejected out. But maximum, if everything all lines up, is about 35 feet. Taller vehicles may be able to kick them out with taller exhaust, maybe kick them out that far. But for the most cars, things like that, you're looking pretty close to the roadway. You'll have multiple points of origin, multiple ignitions along that road system. And you may see particles along the road or shoulder that did not start the fire, did not start a fire. They just did not land in those receptive fuels. But again, you may see them, in that ignition area. And looking here, it's that little silver thing, little light gray thing in the middle of the fire or in the middle of the ignition area. Fairly easy to spot once you start looking for them. Walk that roadside, see if you see some others. And about a third of the vehicles you're going to find broke down on the side of the road within a few miles of the fire after their catalytic converter goes on them. So friction, metal parts scraping on rocks, things like that, or scraping metal on metal cause sparks. Larger particles can be sheared off at 700, 900 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of them may get thousands of degrees as it goes. So, dragging the chains down the highway. Look for, as they're tracked equipment, you'll look for work of, equipment working in the area. Grader strikes, difficulty with those is they may not even know that they started a fire. They may be gone. As far as if you're in a timber harvesting area, look at those hydro axes, those rotary saws. Did they hit something that caused it, or are they malfunctioning and rubbing up against something, misaligned shaft, causing heat, causing sparks to shear off. You can look for strikes on rocks in the area, in the ignition area or near the ignition area. Again, the fire may have started after the operators left the area, so you have to kind of look, so ditch mowing operations, grader operations, things like that, they may be gone by the time the fire starts. If it is something that, a significant fire, you may have to take fine metal particles in the ignition area if something chipped off, and then take control samples from the piece of equipment that you feel caused the fire and send them for forensic evaluation. I have never had to do that, but if you don't necessarily know, or somebody's not fessing up and you feel that that's what it is and it was a significant enough fire, it may be something that you have to do. Fuels, fluids, lubricants happen typically when they're refueling, or they get a fuel line break, hydraulic line break. They have combustible debris accumulated in their engine compartment or near their exhaust system, and they have the fuel get on it. The combustible debris heats up within that engine compartment or near the exhaust system. Now it has fuel on it that will ignite it. Usually pretty easy to find out because the piece of equipment a lot of times will either be broken down or it will start on fire itself. So mechanical breakdown, brake failure, wheel bearings, things like that, dragging tow chains, binders, all of that can also start fires. A mechanical breakdown, it's all equipment caused. And then you get heat transfer, radiant or conductive heat transfer. You get vegetation accumulated up near the exhaust system, especially on like ATVs, UTVs, those off-road vehicles, or somebody's parked their vehicle in the tall grass. A hot exhaust system with the grass touching right up against it, causing fire. We get into railroad as a cause. Basically, railroad ignition is a ignition factor caused from any of the railroad operations, personnel, or rolling stock. Historically, they've been fairly significant. How aggressive prevention has reduced the occurrence. With the introduction of shale oil and stuff like that, frac sand stuff, fracking operations, rail operations for that have increased quite a bit. So they were putting some of the older locomotives back into operation. So there was a significant increase in railroad caused fires there for a little while. But it can be exhaust, carbon, brake shoe, track maintenance, right-of-way burning, dynamic grid failure. So it can be a number of different things. I'll kind of go through each of them relatively quickly here. But these exhaust particles are often sooty or oily, have a pumice-like appearance, be pretty large. You'll see them, diesel, carbon. You'll see them in the ignition area fairly readily. Again, they're pretty large, couple inches, inch and a half or so in size. And you'll see them out there. You're not going to be able to collect them typically with a magnet. They're just not non-magnetic. Average is about 28 feet from the center line. You'll find these, but they can go approximately up to about 45 feet. And they stay active for about 30 seconds. Usually you'll have multiple origins. They're within 45 feet of the railway, on the downwind side of the tracks. They'll also be in areas where they have, they have to slow down or put the pedal to the metal, going up a slope, going up an incline, or when they're just starting up. If they've been parked there for a while and they just start up and get going again, they'll typically kick out a lot more exhaust at that point in time. Brake shoes. Majority of the railroads have gone to composite brakes, which the composite part doesn't cause fire so much, but they wear down and it's attached to a metal plate, or they may be, not aligned properly, not regularly maintained. There is some equipment still out there with metal shoes. There are also some rail companies that are going to disc brakes at this point too. But just like a brake pad on a regular vehicle, it slows the locomotive down, slows the train down by friction. So it generates quite a lot of heat. And if it's a faulty brake shoe, then it can start fires for you. You'll see the particles shear off. They land near the vegetation or land near the railroad tracks, and may actually be in the railroad ties in between the rail tracks. And you might get multiple starts within a short distance. Dynamic grid failure. Basically, a number of locomotives have these traction motors that converted to generators when dynamic brakes are applied. Kind of like a toaster oven, resistor grid to build up the heat and release that heat caused by the braking through the dynamic braking. But they can overheat, they can fail with a violent ejection of hot metal fragments. This is the dynamic brake grid system on a locomotive. When this does fail, it is like a big explosion. The engineer of the locomotive will know what happened. They will hear it. And usually it doesn't go very far. When that happens, they usually stop as soon as they can when they hear that dynamic brake fail. Reason they want to stop quickly is because if they get up too much steam, they're going to have a harder time stopping potentially at a later point. So they stop for maintenance right away. But when that explodes, it can be violent and it can send stuff out. Track maintenance, welding, cutting, grinding of the railways. You'll see the results of any maintenance that are out there as they're, welding rail ties together, or the grinding them to give it that little arc on the rail line. Grinding can be manual, it can be machine grinding. If you've ever seen the grinders roll through, it is pretty impressive. There's just all sorts of sparks coming out from underneath that. It's spraying water like crazy behind it, and usually they have another vehicle, a high rail, following them with about 300 gallons of water too, to try and put out any fires that it may start. What you're seeing in this picture here is grinding slag that's built up behind the grinders, and then it just falls off. It reaches a point, it's too heavy, and it breaks off and falls. Those are extremely hot. They can roll into the vegetation and they can easily start fires. You can pick them up with a magnet, find them with a metal detector. A lot of times, some of the times they're quite large and you don't need to. You can see it pretty easily. This one that you see here is probably about a foot in length. So you'll see that evidence of recent maintenance on it. If it's done by, maintenance crews that are there, they're usually the ones that call it in. It happens pretty quick. Very rarely anymore do you see that they're gone and it happened. They're usually right there. They called it in, and they're the ones that called it in. Signal flares for railroad operations are becoming a little bit less of a regularity. They're going more to LED lights and flashing lights and things like that versus flares, but still a potential that's out there as a signal for railroad operations. You'll see if they're discarded, you'll see the slag in the right of way of the fuel bed. It's pretty easy to see. Wheel slip, it's metal on metal, so it does not always get the best traction on it. In fact, they want the least amount of traction as they can, least amount of friction as they can to increase their fuel efficiency. So it'll happen usually when they're first starting out, after they've been sitting for a little while. You'll find thin, elongated metal shavings at the origin. Looking at the rails, you can see it kind of has this weird look to it. Or you may get something significant like this, although this is really rare. This was sent to me by a friend of mine, another investigator, and what had happened is one of the locomotives within the line didn't get the message that it was supposed to power down when they stopped. So it just sat there and the wheels kept trying to push and push and push. The one locomotive tried to, but it just couldn't move the whole thing. So it just sat there and did a significant amount of damage to that tracks, as you can see. With wheel slip and those fragments that may come off, the one difficult part is within a couple hours, they're going to start to rust. So it may look like they've been there forever and they may be pretty fresh. So just recognize that. Journal box here, what they call the hot box. This is where the bearings are on the wheels. If they lose their lubrication, lose their packing in there, they can catch fire, eject burning material, sparks, blow out a bearing just like you can on a vehicle. Usually you'll see starts really close to the tracks or even on the railroad ties themselves. And the train may have stopped due to a detector warning. Majority of the roads, all of them, as far as I know, have sensors along the tracks and, at a lot of railroad crossings that actually is measuring the temperatures as the trains pass by, measuring the temperatures of those hot boxes. And if there's anything that seems out of the ordinary, something that seems hotter than it should be, warning is sent to the locomotive and the engineer, and they'll stop and take a look and see what's going on. Railroads, generally, it's easy to establish the cause. In Wisconsin, the kind of the nice thing that we have is essentially it's case law, that if a train has gone through, there was no fire before the train went through, there was fire shortly after the train went through. After eliminating other causes, the railroad is the cause. So you don't necessarily have to find exactly what it was, but that's here in Wisconsin. I can't say for anywhere else. So that is kind of one of the nice things, but you have to do a thorough investigation to eliminate all other causes. If you want more information on investigating railroad caused fires, there is this training on nwcg.gov, online training.nwcg.gov /node/216. Do look for it, and they have an investigating railroad caused fires for more information. The other thing that is nice that we have in the state of Wisconsin is we have the authority in Chapter 26. Any forest ranger, conservation warden, sheriff, or other duly appointed authority. This can be ATF, this can be fire chief, may, in the performance of official duties, require any train causing fires or suspected of causing fires to stop within a safe distance from the fires to avoid further setting of the spread of that fire. We have the ability, the authority to stop that train, and that train is not to move until we say that it's okay for it to move. They will fight you on this, especially if that train is sitting there for a little while, because with railroads, if you stop a train here in southern Wisconsin, you're backing up things down in Texas and Florida. Things that they time things pretty carefully, because trains really cannot pass each other on the tracks except for a few places. And the one thing I heard from one railroad company is that it costs the company about $1 million an hour for that train to be sitting there because of how everything else is all stacked up and out of line. So it's something, as soon as we can, we want to work with them. They don't want to start any fires either, but we want to work with them, try and get that thing going as quickly as we can. Take a look at it, send somebody who's familiar with trains over to take a look at it, get there as quickly as you can, to get it rolling as soon as possible. And we want to work with the railroad companies on that. But we can, in the state of Wisconsin, we can bill railroad companies for suppression costs and damages. Children is another cause. Looking at kids 12 years old or younger as far as children caused. And you see the typical stuff, kids playing with fire, fireworks, things like that. A lot of times it will be in an area, maybe near a residence, but out of sight of that residence. You'll see that activity, the kids' activity there. And, you may see toys, things like that. The best one I had was kids that started a fire by burning Pokemon cards. And when I asked them why they were burning Pokemon cards, their answer was, I don't know, just being stupid, I guess. So as far as interviewing children, you got to be a little bit cautious with that. If they are juveniles, you can talk to them, that's fine. If you start getting into a more significant interview process, always have it audio recorded, and if you can, video recorded as well. But look at your local, talk to your local authorities, law enforcement authorities, to see about all of that. Whether the parents are involved or not, or there or not, that can depend as well. And having some of the parents there sometimes can be a hindrance. I've had it both ways where it's, you know, the mother smacks the kid in the back of the head and says, here, tell him what you did. And I've also had, you know, before the kid can say anything, how dare you accuse my little Johnny of starting this fire? My little Johnny would never ever do something like this. And they don't let the kid talk. So children can be interesting. But it's usually pretty easy to figure out if the kids started a fire. Miscellaneous cause kind of lumps a bunch of things in here. It's that catch-all category. You know, it's all other things. And a lot of times, you know, these are raised as defenses. You know, well, what about this? What about that? Power lines are under miscellaneous, but they kind of have their subset of of the miscellaneous. Kind of are their own things. A lot of times they're in remote locations. Weather conditions cause it. You know, things like that. You could have down conductors. The power lines themselves are down on the ground, arcing, starting a fire. You may see see arcing, charring on a branch. You may get the tree actually on the power line yet. You see that it's been charred up there, dropping, burning stuff down to the bottom of the ground, starting your wildland fire there. Could see sooting and staining on the conductor itself. The conductor is the power line. You could have blowholes near the base of the tree, or you could have where it went back down the line. I had one fire where an individual dropped a tree, was cutting trees, dropped it on the power line, and it actually sent the charge back down. There was a power pole about 2 lengths down that had a ground wire, and it sent it down that and started the fire there. The individual who dropped the tree on the power line was going to be probably, I'm sure, getting a significant bill from the power company themselves. May see electrical resistance scar on tree trunk similar to lightning. And you'll get fulgurites, you know, basically where if it's sandy soil, you get that power current, that current going through the soil, melting it, turning it into these fulgurites. They're pretty fragile rocks on them, but they're neat to look at. Lightning will cause these as well, but power lines are a good cause of it because that arc is there for quite a while before the power is shut off. So looking at that power line fail, you may get lines sag during hot days, and arc to the ground, get conductor failures, insulator failures. Take a look at some of that equipment. Fuses, disconnects, things like that. Dropping metal to the ground. When these occur, fuses occur and stuff, usually there's a power outage in the area as well. So it's pretty easy to determine. And power companies, the linemen are pretty good about talking to you about it if you can talk to them. Animals are the other thing with power lines. Birds, squirrels, you'll usually find them at the base of the power pole. They get fried and drop down and start the fire. Fireworks, pretty obvious cause. You can usually see the results of the fireworks there on the ground. Firearms, ammunition don't cause as much. The actual ammunition and the fires, you know, you may get incendiary rounds, tracer rounds that can start fires. But what's becoming more of an issue for us are these exploding targets and this tannerite type stuff. Makes for a good explosion when they're hit, but you'll see the results of it. You know, in this picture, you can see it's a half a pound of tannerite underneath the hood, and you can see the hood up in the air, about 20 feet up in the air in the upper right-hand corner of the picture. So you'll see the blast damage and stuff. Cutting, welding, fairly obvious. You know, the workers will probably still be in the area. If it's a welder, he may not know that he started a fire right away because he's focused on the welding and looking right in front of him. He's not seeing what's happening on the ground behind him. So, but pretty obvious what happens in those. Spontaneous heating, for us here in the Lake States, the majority of the times that we get spontaneous heating, place where I can see it is hay bales. Bales are wrapped when they're a little too wet, put under pressure, and they catch on fire. Electric fences usually are not a big issue now because all electric fences have to be UL approved, and the weed burner, weed clipper types usually aren't in use anymore. But you do get some farmers out there that still like to use them. Take a look, see if they've run into, been rubbing up against a tree, etc. Last thing, kind of quickly go through arson recognition. Arson or incendiary, often used interchangeably where you're at, depending upon where you are. Hot sets, these can be difficult to find the arsonist. Use of a lighter leaves no evidence, but they may rearrange the fuel bed a little bit to get things to burn good. Some examples of delay devices that arsonists, serial arsonists will use. Matches with cigarettes. The cigarette burns down until it comes in contact with the match head, ignites the match head, and that ignites the fuel. So here's just some devices that were discovered. They may use a road flare, fusee or road flare, but you'll see the slag out there. If this is sitting in an area where it really has no reason to be there, or they may have, like in this case, they balanced it on a rock as a delay device. As it burned, then it fell down and started a fire. The suspect may have burn holes or residue on their car upholstery, clothing, shoes, etc. if you can find the suspect. Cotton rope with matches tied to them. Light the rope on fire, toss that out, rope burns down, ignites the matches, causing the fire. By this time, all of these delay devices, the arsonist is now 10, 15, 20 minutes. They've had to get farther down the road and get away from you. But you can find some of the stuff that's out there. Finding these match heads and things, if it's something like this, it's a little bit easier. Finding individual matches, it's extremely tough, but you can find them. Looking at an incense stick, paper matches. Again, they light the incense stick, set it out there, it burns down. By the time it hits the match heads, it ignites the matches, and the matches are the ones that actually start the fire. This is one of my favorites. They put wrap a rock in paper, light the paper on fire. The rock is just simply there to give them more heft to be able to throw it. If you find a rock that seems a little bit out of place, go ahead and move it. There may be some unburned paper underneath. Just couldn't burn because the rock was protecting it. This was one that I found on a arson fire here in Wisconsin, and there's a small rock on the inside of this, and they took paper and they wrapped it up basically into kind of a ball and taped it. And the hole that we believe there was we couldn't find, but we believe there was some type of wick, whether it was a birthday candle or something like that. It was about that size of a hole that allowed it to, that wick allowed it to get down there and start the fire. But the small rock in there allowed them to throw it about 20 feet off of the road edge. But take a look at, what you see out there, and think about what questions to ask. In this case, it looks like, well, you've got this line of burnt area up to where the fire started. But in reality, this one was a debris burning cause. They used gas as a trailer to ignite the pile. And I found the gas can where it's sitting there by that nice gorilla on the left-hand side of the screen. But in the interview with the person, he admitted this is what he did to get that pile ignited so he could burn the pile, and it ended up getting away from him. So I know that was fairly rushed. I tried to take the NWCG course as a week-long course, a 40-hour course, and tried to get it down to an hour, hit some of the high points. But if you have questions at any point, at any time in the future, here's my contact information. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email. More than happy to answer any questions. For those in Wisconsin, especially Southwest Wisconsin, where I'm located, if you have a suspicious fire, give me a call. I can come and do the investigation for you or help you with the investigation. So that's what I have, Bill. I'll kick it back to you. I've seen some stuff popping through the chat, so we can get to some of those questions.
Yeah, just a couple of questions for you. If you can, I'll put your contact information in the chat if anybody wants to grab it from there. And then you can unshare your screen, and then you can look at the chat as well. A couple of questions about technology. Are you using any specific technology when it comes to wildland fire investigations, like thermal imaging or UAVs? Can you speak to that for us?
Thermal imaging, as far as, for investigations, absolutely can help. It's something that, we don't have the thermal imaging. The reason being is, they're getting cheaper, but they're still kind of expensive, and we have a large number of wildland investigators. But what we do have is access to fire departments who have the thermal imaging cameras. So we can borrow from them if need be. UAVs are still kind of for us, it's an unknown. We do have a couple. We haven't utilized them for fire investigation, but we have our aircraft that fly overhead, our piloted aircraft that fly overhead and take photos for us. Those are extremely helpful for railroad fires as well, because they can show, by the time we get everything wrapped up, and a lot of times ignitions are close together, we take 3 ignitions and turn them into one fire as far as suppression wise, but we can get pictures of here's those 3 separate fires to show us that. UAVs, I think, will probably be coming in a little bit more, but for us here in Wisconsin, as with DNR, as far as investigation, we haven't tried it yet.
Okay. A lot of people are using a lot of different resources to get lightning strike reports. Specifically, someone mentioned the Weather Bug app. Someone else mentioned StrikeNet, which I'm familiar with that one. And then Core Logic. You had mentioned something about the Bureau of Land Management. Is that something that everyone would have access to, or is that just your agency?
Not everyone has access to the Bureau of Land Management. And yeah, there are some of those other apps and things that are out there, a lot more common, that everybody can get access to. Bureau of Land Management, basically you need an account set up with them. You need to be a wildland agency, I believe, to do it. And our person that handled it, that was our contact, we had a single contact for Wisconsin DNR. She has since retired, and I'm not sure who the new person is for us to do that. But yes, I know there's other things like WeatherBug and things like that that have it, that allow you to do some of that stuff as well. So the Bureau of Land Management system is not something that everybody can get a hold of, but I just said that as an example. It's one that we have used in the past.
Gotcha. If anyone else has any other questions, I believe those were all the questions that we have. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and then we can take any other questions that anybody else would have.
All right, sounds good.